When Don was communicating with Ra, Don spoke with Ra. There was no separation. We would call it a social memory complex, thus indicating manyness. To their understanding, Don was speaking to an individualized portion of consciousness. Don always spoke to the same entity through a channel or instrument. This entity was with the social memory complex of which it was a part, one of those who voyaged outward from another planet within our own solar system. They visited our peoples 18,000 years ago and did not land, again 11,000 years ago. As they first appeared in the skies over Egypt, our people saw a crystal-powered bell-shaped craft. They allowed visibility because it did not make any difference. This did not affect them due to their firm conviction that many wondrous things occurred as a normal part of a world, as we would call it, in which many deities had powerful control over supernatural events. At the time, there were those who chose to worship the hawk-headed sun god, which we know as vibrational sound complex, Horus. This vibrational sound complex has taken other vibrational sound complexes, the object of worship being the sun disk, represented in some distortion. They were drawn to spend some time, as we would call it, scanning the peoples for a serious interest, amounting to a seeking with which they might help without infringement. They found that at that time, the social complex was quite self-contradictory in its so-called religious beliefs, and therefore, there was not an appropriate calling for their vibration. Thus, at that time, they departed without taking action. The next attempt was prolonged. It occurred over a period of time. The nexus or center of their efforts was a decision upon their parts that there was a sufficient calling to attempt to walk among our peoples as brothers. When they were in the sixth dimension, their physical beings were what we would call golden. They were tall and somewhat delicate. Their physical body complex covering, which we call the integument, had a golden luster. In this form they decided to come among our peoples. They laid this plan before the Council of Saturn, offering themselves as service-oriented wanderers, of the type which land directly upon the inner planes, without incarnative processes. From the sixth dimension, they are capable of manipulating, by thought, the intelligent infinity present in each particle of light, or distorted light, so that they were able to clothe themselves in a replica visible in the third density of their mind-body-spirit complexes in the sixth density. Thus they emerged or materialized in physical chemical complexes representing as closely as possible their natures, this effort being to appear as brothers and spend a limited amount of time as teachers of the law of one, for there was an ever stronger interest in the sun body, and this vibrates in concordance with their particular distortions. They were allowed this experiment by the council which guards this planet. It was their naive belief that they could learn by direct contact, and the free will distortions of individual feeling or personality were in no danger, they thought, of being disturbed, as these cultures were already closely aligned, with an all-embracing belief in the liveness or consciousness of all. They came and were welcomed by the peoples, whom they wished to serve. They have walked among us only at that time, 11,000 years ago. Our peoples at that time were much unlike them in physical appearance, as we might call it. They thus did not mix well with the population and were obviously other than our peoples. They discovered that for each word they could utter, there were 30 impressions they gave by their very being, which confused those entities they had come to serve. They spoke to one who heard and understood, and was in a position to decree the law of one. However, the priests and peoples of that era quickly distorted their message, robbing it of the, shall we say, compassion with which unity is informed by its very nature. Since it contains all, it cannot abhor any. When they were no longer able to have appropriate channels through which to enunciate the law of one, they removed themselves from the hypocritical position which they had allowed themselves to be placed in. Thus, their visit was relatively short, for they found themselves in the hypocritical position of being acclaimed as other than earthly other selves. After a short period, they removed themselves from these entities and spent much time attempting to understand how best to serve those to whom they had offered themselves in love light. And other myths, shall we say, other understandings having more to do with polarity and the things of our vibrational complex, again took over in that particular society complex. The ones who were in contact with that geographical entity, which we know of as Atlantis, had conceived of the potentials for healing by use of the pyramid-shaped entities. In considering this and making adjustments for the differences in the distortion complexes of the two geographical cultures, as we would call them, they went before the council again, offering this plan to the council as an aid to the healing and the longevity of those in the area we know of as Egypt. In this way, they hoped to facilitate the learning process, as well as offering philosophy, articulating the law of one. Again, the council approved. Approximately 8,500 years ago, having considered these concepts carefully, they returned, never having left in thought, to the thought form areas of our vibrational planetary complex, and considered for some of our years, as we measure time, how to appropriately build these structures. The first, the Great Pyramid, was formed approximately 6,000 years ago. At that time, they were not in close contact with incarnate entities upon our plane. They were responding to a general calling of sufficient energy in that particular location to merit action. They sent thoughts to all who were seeking their information. The appearance of the pyramid was a matter of tremendous surprise. However, it was carefully designed to coincide with the incarnation of one known as a great architect. This entity was later made into a deity, in part due to this occurrence. This deity had the sound vibration complex, Imhotep. Then, in sequence after this, performing by thought of the building or architecture of the Great Pyramid, using the more, shall we say, local or earthly material rather than thought-form material to build other pyramidical structures. This continued for approximately 1,500 years. Meanwhile, the information concerning initiation and healing by crystal was being given. They attempted to aid Egyptians in technical ways, having to do with the healing of mind-body-spirit complex distortions through the use of the crystal appropriate to the distortion, placed within a certain appropriate series of ratios of time-space material. Thus were the pyramids created. They found that the technology was reserved largely for those with the effectual mind-body distortion of power. This was not intended by the law of one. They left our peoples. However, they have never left our vibration. Due to their responsibility for the changes in consciousness they had first caused and then found distorted in ways not relegated to the law of one. They attempted to contact the rulers of the land to which they had come, that land which we call Egypt, or in some areas, the Holy Land. In the 18th dynasty, as it is known in our records of space-time distortions, they were able to contact a pharaoh, as we would call him. The man was small in life experience on our plane and was a wanderer. Thus, this mind-body-spirit complex received their communication distortions and was able to blend his distortions with their. He was able to perceive this information without significant distortion and for a time moved, shall we say, heaven and earth in order to invoke the law of one and to order the priesthood of these structures in accordance with the distortions of initiation and true compassionate healing. This was not to be long-lasting. This young entity had been given a vibratory complex of sound which vibrated in honor of a prosperous god which they call Amun. The entity decided that this name, being in honor of one among many gods, was not acceptable for inclusion in his vibratory sound complex. Thus, he changed his name to one which honored the sun disk. This distortion, called Aten, was a close distortion to their reality as they understand their own nature of mind-body-spirit complex distortion. However, it does not come totally into alignment with the intended teach learning which was sent. This entity, Akhenaten, became convinced that the vibration of one was the true spiritual vibration and thus decreed the law of one. However, this entity's beliefs were accepted by very few. His priests gave lip service only, without the spiritual distortion towards seeking. The peoples continued in their beliefs. At this entity's physical dissolution from the third density physical plane, their teachings became quickly perverted, their structures returning once again to the use of the so-called royal, or those with distortions towards power. When this entity was no longer in this density, again the polarized beliefs in the many gods came into their own and continued so, until the one known as Muhammad delivered the peoples into a more intelligible distortion of mind-body-spirit relationships. The last 2,300 years, they had used channels such as this one. But in most cases, the channels felt inspired by dreams and visions without being aware, consciously, of their identity or existence. For example, the entities of the nation of Egypt were in a state of pantheism, as we may call the distortion towards separate worship of various portions of the Creator. They were able to contact one whose orientation was towards the One. This particular group had been accentuatedly trained to recognize such contact. This made this group able to be aware of a focal or vibrational source of information.